Most holiday park reviews are filmed on day one when everything feels fresh. This one isn't. We've been coming back to Sandymouth for 5 years. Our son was 4 when we first came, now he's 9. So when I tell you whether this place is worth booking, you're getting 5 years of honest opinion and not just a highlights reel. And I'll tell you up front, it's not perfect, but that might actually be why it keeps working for us. Sandymouth is great, but I am not going to tell you that it's perfect, because let's face it, nowhere is. What I am going to tell you is why we keep choosing it over cottages, over bigger parks and other options in Cornwall. We've tried other Cornish parks, Hendra, Finn Lake, and we keep coming back here, and I'll tell you why. We first came in 2020, just the 3 of us on a budget, needing somewhere with evening entertainment so that our son actually had something to do, and we've been back 5 more times since. That tells you something, but so does the fact that we've stayed in 5 different accommodations across the entire site. We continue to book Sandymouth, and honestly it comes down to a couple of reasons. The first being the price, which I'll go into in just a moment, and second is the entertainment, and I'll also tell you later on the one thing that nearly put us off coming back for a 6th time and why we're glad we ignored it. I'll be completely honest, I've never been one of those parents that has rushed to the evening entertainment. I'm a pretty introverted person, so you'll never usually see me rush up and get dancing or doing anything like that. But I've come to realize it's not the facilities of holiday parks that matter, it's the people running it. The size of the pool doesn't matter too much. Let's face it, you're not in there all day every day. The restaurant doesn't matter all that much either. We tend to cook a lot ourselves or eat out most of the time, although it's nice to know you can get good food if you want it, and spoiler, Sandymouth's food is pretty decent. To us, what matters is the kids' entertainment, somewhere your kids actually want to go to and want to go back to every night. At Sandymouth, the entertainment is genuinely good, and Owen is the reason for that. Now, our son always wants to go back to Sandymouth because of Owen. He actually remembers the kids, not just their names, but actually gets to know them. Our son's been going, like I say, since he was 4, and Owen still remembers him every single time. Even though our son's now 9, he's starting to outgrow the kids' entertainment a little bit, and let's face it, he does think he's about 19, but he does still go because he knows Owen, and he does generally make friends there. When we went to Hendra, we had a good time, but it was definitely bigger, a lot more expensive, and the entertainment felt very commercial. At Sandymouth, the team actually know the kids, and that's the reason why our son wants to go every single evening, have a drink, enjoy the music, and a bit of a quiz. The entertainment is the main reason that we come back, but there are a few other things that mean we've never seriously considered switching to somewhere else, and one of them surprised us. First of all, the staff. Over the 5 or 6 years that we've been going, most of the staff are the same faces. They're always friendly and do an incredible job no matter how busy it gets. One of the biggest factors as to why we book Sandymouth is the location. It's on the border of Cornwall and Devon, so it's not as a long drive from the Midlands going all the way further down into Cornwall. If you want a beach, Sandymouth Beach is one of my favourites. It's about a 15-minute walk from the park, or you can drive down and use the car park. It's a little rocky getting down onto the actual beach, but once you're on it, there is sand everywhere. Rock pools full of crabs, plenty of space to build sandcastles. Our son absolutely loves it. We often use Sandymouth as a base and explore from there. Bude is only about 10 minutes away. There's a nice beach, a castle, and even a lake where you can hire paddle boats. There are some great restaurants too. The Olive Tree is one that we always go back to. The garlic prawns are so good that Rach has to have them at least once on every visit to Cornwall. Padstow is around about 30 to 40 minutes away, and honestly it's one of my favourite places in the UK. We've had some brilliant evenings there. Paul Ainsworth number 6 is a proper treat if you fancy date night, and Bin 2 does a great Negroni if you want a cocktail somewhere nice. At Sandymouth there are different types of accommodation. Over the years we've stayed in 5 of them, 3 caravans and 2 lodges. All of them have been clean, comfortable, and have everything that you need. If it's just me, Rach, and our son, we'll usually go for a caravan. If we're going with Rach's parents, like we did this February, then we'll probably get a lodge for that extra space. To give you an idea on the price difference, for the first week of August, over 7 nights, the cheapest option is the Bodmin 2-bed caravan at £689. Mid-range is the Boscastle Seaview 3-bed at £1,375, and the Atlantic View Lodge comes in at £1,599. So you're looking at a £200 to £250 more for a lodge versus a decent 3-bed caravan. Is it worth it? The lodges are super nice, more space, better layout, and just feels a little bit more premium, but the caravans are absolutely absolutely fine. Like I said, they're clean, well maintained, and everything works. We've never walked into one and thought this is tired or this needs replacing, and that matters more than the upgrade. Honestly, if it's just the three of us, we'd definitely save the £250. That means more meals out or extra activities. The caravan does the job. But if you've got your in-laws or your two families sharing, the lodge is definitely worth it for that extra space. You're not on top of each other, and that matters over the week. So before you automatically go for the lodge, ask yourself who you're traveling with and whether the extra space will actually change your week. For most families, 3 or 4, the caravan is the right call. And this is actually the second big reason why we keep booking Sandymouth. Compared to other holiday parks in Cornwall, the value is generally hard to beat. Like I say, we've been to Sandymouth 6 times over the last 5 years. Some years we've even been twice. We've tried Finn Lake, we've tried Hendra, and we keep coming back. And the reason is incredibly simple. The entertainment team makes our son happy. The food is good, the staff are brilliant, the beach is lovely, and we can actually relax. And that's what we're paying for. A week where we're not constantly planning, constantly entertaining, constantly stressed. We know what we're getting and it works. Is it perfect? No, it's not cheap. The kids' entertainment won't work for every age, and if your kids don't engage with the team, you won't get the same value that we do. But for us, yes, it definitely is worth it. If you're still on the fence, my honest advice is this: if your kids are in that 4 to 10 age range and you want a week where you're not doing all of the heavy lifting, Sandymouth takes a lot of the pressure off. That's generally hard to put a price on. Now, I mentioned earlier there was something that nearly put us off coming back for the 6th time, and honestly, it was our son starting to age out of the entertainment. We weren't sure it would still work for him at 9, but it does, just differently. He's less on stage, more making friends around the park, same results, he still doesn't want to leave. This February, we stayed in the Atlantic View Lodge with Rachel's parents, and we had a brilliant week. Our son loved the beach, I won bingo twice, and even got dancer of the night, which was clearly a sympathy vote, and we just had a really relaxed time. Would we book a 7th time? Absolutely. In fact, we've already booked for Christmas this year. That's something that we've never done before.